introduce our guest. Hey, John.
Yes.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. My name is Lisa. I'm the chair of the Open and Affirming Committee, and we are holding this seminar to educate our congregation on the bills that are going through the House and the Senate right now. And I figured you would be the best person to speak about that and provide a little more education, because I know you're like on the ground making it happen. And
happy to do so.
Yeah, if you could just stopping it from happening. So if you just want to introduce yourself, and we're kind of focusing on the two bills, the Don't Say Gay and the woke.
Stop Woke Act.
Stop Woke, yes. So yeah, if you wanted to just provide a little bit of education on that, I think we would all benefit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay, take it away.
Right, and I'm actually going to see if I can share my screen for a slideshow presentation. I promise I will not PowerPoint y'all to death here.
Okay.
But let's see if I have screen sharing abilities. Okay, can you all see that slide?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Well, sounds good. Good morning. I appreciate you all making for the time for this on a Sunday. It is an incredibly important time to have you all engaged, so we really appreciate it. I'm John Harris Maurer, pronouns he, him, and I'm Equality Florida's Public Policy Director. I am based up here in Tallahassee all year round, and as the Public Policy Director, that basically means I'm the frontline lobbyist in the Capitol, part of our public policy team. We have a lot moving. It is incredible that we are only about halfway through legislative session, but it does feel like a session unlike any we've seen in a while. So we'll talk a little bit about just sort of the dynamics as we come into session, and then the two particular bills that I know you all are focused on. It is worth noting there are more than 100 bills that Equality Florida is tracking. Those are not all necessarily bad bills. There are proactive bills out there. Unfortunately, they're not moving like the bad ones are. But when I say 100, that doesn't mean all 100 are attacks on the community. But unfortunately, a lot of them that are moving are in that lane. So I can see y'all, but it's a little bit hard on my screen. So if there are questions, you can feel free to jump in. I'm happy to have this as sort of more of a conversation. But before we do get into that, by a show of hands, has anybody had a chance to either come to Tallahassee before to talk to a lawmaker or make a call, talk to a lawmaker's office? All right, good stuff. Well, I appreciate it. We're doing a lot of that public push right now. So we are feeling the impacts of those efforts. And all right. So to just give a little bit of grounding on where we are, this session feels like it is really being driven by a 2024 DeSantis presidential run. One of the Democrats in committee actually just this week said, you know, Governor DeSantis can run his own campaign. He doesn't need all of you doing it for him. But we're seeing a lot of culture war politics that are really not responsive to what are the issues most important to everyday Floridians. But whether that is things like the Don't Say Gay bill, the Stop Woke Act, we're really looking at this as what we call a surveillance slate. There is a lot of censorship, a lot of putting the government into our workplaces, our classrooms, our doctor's offices, our homes, even bills about cameras in classrooms. So really just a lot of this sort of fear mongering, a lot of bills, including some of the ones today that create new causes of action, new places for folks to bring lawsuits. That is all about, I think, instilling fear in this sort of chilling environment. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the specific bills. It's worth saying really at the outset of session, we thought the thing that we would be focused on the most would be a transgender youth medical care ban. That was filed. It would ban doctors from providing any affirming care to transgender youth, and even subject them to up to a year in jail for providing that care, even though it is best practice care. So that bill has been filed. Fortunately, it was only filed in the House, not in the Senate, and it hasn't moved to date. So it looks like that one is not the most pressing. So that's kind of why we're not focusing on it so much today. But as I say that, it is worth keeping in mind, we have basically another month to go of legislative session. It is 60 days of session. We'll end on March 11th. And anything can happen between now and then. You may be familiar with last year's fight against the transgender youth athlete ban. And that one, we successfully killed 3 different versions of the bill, which was great. And then in the 11th hour, they amended virtually the same provision onto an unrelated bill and rammed it through the process. So we can't really ignore any of these, but there are a couple that we can see at this point in session really have a lot of momentum. And so those are some of the ones that we'll focus on today. Particularly, I know Lisa mentioned the Don't Say Gay bill and the so-called Stop Woke Act. So any questions before we get into a little more specifics on those bills?
Nope, good.
All right, and I will drop a footnote here since y'all are in the Gainesville area. I don't know if any of you are represented by State Rep Yvonne Hinson. She's in her first term, but she's great, and she does have one of the proactive bills that we like, the Healthcare Transparency Act. So I can talk about that a little bit later if there are questions, but worth just noting that she's up in Tallahassee doing great work. Is there a question there? Sorry.
It was a yay.
It was a yay.
Okay. The audio is a little hard to hear on your end, so yeah, just let me know if there's a question and I'll make sure to get to it. So the bill that y'all have hopefully and probably heard a lot about is this quote unquote Don't Say Gay bill. It has gotten a lot of attention. We're seeing national focus on it. Equality Florida's executive director, Nadine Smith, I know, did a radio station interview in Australia on Thursday. So people are paying attention to this bill because of how egregious it is. It literally says that a school district is banned from classroom discussion, from encouraging classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity. And that applies in so-called primary grades or any grade where it would be age inappropriate or developmentally inappropriate. And we have obviously a lot of reservations about that because fundamentally there is no age where it's inappropriate to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity. When you're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, you're talking about who we love and who we are. And that's never an inappropriate topic. LGBTQ folks are a normal, healthy part of society, and we deserve to be acknowledged, and our families deserve to be acknowledged just like anybody else. We know that even in primary grades, there are young folks who may be LGBTQ, and there are kids who have same-sex parents or LGBTQ parents, and they deserve to see themselves in their curriculum like anyone else. So in committee on Tuesday, the bill had its first Senate hearing, and one of the senators supporting it said, well, what if you have teachers starting to talk about hypotheticals about, Johnny has 2 mommies or 2 daddies and he has 5 apples and yada, yada. And it's like, there is nothing wrong about that. And when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, it is worth noting that in fact, everyone has a sexual orientation and a gender identity. This is not just LGBTQ folks, but that sort of gets lost in this rhetoric because it is unfortunately rooted in that anti-LGBTQ animosity. We know that's what the focus is here. But really, if you were banning outright discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity, you can't talk about opposite sex couples either, or people's cisgender identity that does align with their sex assigned at birth, even if they're not transgender or non-binary. So I think it's really poor language here, and we see that a lot. There's just these vague concepts, and again, this is a place where if a parent feels like the this new would-be statute is being violated, they can sue the school and the teacher. And it'll have a real chilling effect because there are a lot of school districts that have LGBTQ support guidelines that help teachers, administrators, school counselors understand how to be there for and support LGBTQ youth. But if we have these sort of sloppily drafted laws on the books, we're already seeing that it will have a chilling effect. And you've already got counties like Leon County that is looking at its guidance, at its LGBTQ support guidance with an eye towards this bill and getting ready to undertake revisions because they're just concerned that they don't want to be anywhere near a potential liability. Our schools are already overburdened and underfunded, and they just don't want to take on that risk. And we know that it's the LGBTQ young folks who will suffer from losing those kind of supports. So the bill also has a provision that requires more Department of Education oversight of school guidelines and frameworks. And we have a lot of concerns about that because we've seen some hostile anti-LGBTQ moves from the Department of Education as recently as December, 2 months ago. The Department of Education for Florida had a website on bullying prevention, and somebody elevated to the department and noted that it had LGBTQ resources. Of course, it should have those sort of resources because unfortunately, we know that LGBTQ youth seriously consider or attempt suicide at a rate nearly 4 times that of their non-LGBTQ peers. And it is not because they are LGBTQ, but it is because they face the sort of discrimination, harassment, and bullying that these resources are supposed to help protect against. When the Department of Education was alerted that there were those LGBTQ specific provisions in there, they first removed all of the anti-bullying materials and then only reinstated it once they had stripped away all of the LGBTQ protections. So we have a very valid skepticism of having more DOE oversight here, though logically it should be an agency that our community could rely on. So this bill is moving quickly. It has passed one of its 2 House committees already. It's worth noting in the legislative process, and I'll try to not get too in the weeds here. Again, please do stop me if I'm using terms or jargon that's unfamiliar, but every bill that's introduced will get referred to certain committees. So those are the smaller groups that hear the legislation before it goes to the full 120 House members or the full 40 senators for a vote. And they have to pass those committees in order. Usually bills are given 3 committees of reference. But in this case, you can see on the bullet point there where it says process, on the House side, it was only given 2 committees of reference. And that basically means it is being fast-tracked and it's easier for that bill to move through the process. So a lot of concerns there. And as of this past week, on Tuesday morning, it did also pass its first Senate committee. So moving in both chambers, again, we've got a month still to go in session. So that's a lot of time for it to get through those other committee stops. I will also pause here to say we had a phenomenal turnout on Tuesday in that Senate committee. It happened to coincide with Equality Florida's lobby days, which if it had to be put on the agenda, was actually a great coincidence. We had more than 80 folks sign up on the bill. Of those, I think 50 were registered to speak, and there were only 2 folks who spoke in support of the bill. So a really strong turnout. We heard Republicans both in that Senate committee and House committee express concerns with the bill and how vague it is and how the terms are undefined and some of the provisions. So that is a good sign. I mean, unfortunately, we're seeing increasingly in the legislature, the Republicans and Democrats tend to move in blocks. It's hard to sort of peel them off because particularly for the Republicans, they're facing a lot of pressure. It is a very top-down system where the House Speaker or the Senate President has a lot of power and control over whether their bills get heard, what committees they get assigned to, sort of where they are in leadership. And I think in a way that we haven't always seen, it's been made a lot more clear that they sort of need to stay in line. So sometimes we find that our Republican allies will listen to us and they're willing to share those sort of concerns in committee. So that outreach really does help. It does shape the debate. And unfortunately in this case, they sort of said, we have all these concerns, but I'll vote for it today to let it move to the next committee. And, I hope it gets remedied as it moves through the process. So an example of that is even in this idea of banning discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity in quote unquote primary grades. That is one of those places where it is so clear that this bill is not informed by what is going on in Florida, because Florida does not use the term primary grades anywhere. I mean, it is not defined in this bill. It is not defined in our K through 12 education code. It is not defined in Florida statutes at all. So some of the sort of analysts in the process have looked at other education rules and said this means K through 3. The House bill sponsor said this is K through 5. I've heard from teachers who say, under certain federal regulations, that is K through 8. So clearly somebody unfamiliar with Florida's process or from out of state, which we often see, drafted this law without a real eye to what is going on in Florida and just for political points. So, we hear lawmakers bring up concerns like that, but unfortunately, right now, it didn't stop the bill in that committee. It's just sort of given them something to work on in the interim. So I know I've covered a lot there about the Don't Say Gay bill already. And just to be clear, again, on that slide, this is the Don't Say Gay bill. HB is House bill. So it's House Bill 1557 and SB, Senate Bill 1834. Most bills are introduced in each chamber, and then those bills will move independently. But like I mentioned with the transgender youth medical care ban, that bill was only filed in one chamber, only filed in the House by Representative Anthony Sabatini, whose name you may know if you follow Florida politics. And it didn't have a Senate companion, which is another strong sign against that bill that there wasn't enough interest to get a Senate counterpart to it. So any questions on that? All right.
No questions.
Sounds good. And it's worth noting what we were calling the Don't Say Gay bill, the legislature officially refers to as, I believe, parental rights in education. And whenever I hear parents' rights, I have to sort of wonder which parents, because we know we have LGBTQ parents, and their kids should be able to talk about them in class, or if they're assigned to draw stick figure pictures of their families as 6-year-olds, if there's 2 mommies or 2 daddies in that picture, it should be something that can be discussed just like any other kid's picture. And we certainly don't disagree with the concept of parental rights. Again, we have parents who are terrific supporters for their LGBTQ youth and great advocates. But we also know that not everybody is fortunate enough to have affirming and supportive parents like that. And we have to consider those families too when our lawmakers are putting forward this kind of legislation. All right.
Lisa, question. You can relay it maybe to the whole issue of parents being able to sue a teacher who brings this up as a way of enforcing this. It reminds me sort of the Texas abortion and abortion law. How does that work? I mean, can that be separated out as another tactic? It seems to me that's the fearful, the threatening part of it. How is it enforced by parents suing?
So the question,
say a little more about that.
Yeah, if you could say a little bit more of how this would be enforced, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is somewhat of a newer, thank you for the question. And it is somewhat of a newer phenomenon. I don't think this is drawn as directly from the Texas abortion bill, but it is in that same field of having more, again, causes of action for people to bring suit. So rather than it just being that the government can bring enforcement when they see a law being broken, now you do have that similar, deputization of individual parents, whatnot, who can bring lawsuits. I'll actually say the more sort of off the wall example even than this that we see is in how school materials and library materials can be objected to. And again, it's sort of coming from this frame of parental rights. But under Florida law, you can have anyone in the county object to school materials. They don't have to be a parent of somebody in the public school system. They don't even have to be a parent. But somebody with an agenda can basically deprive everyone else in the county of their parental rights by objecting to materials and getting them removed from the class. So it is, like you said, a place where you see that sort of broad public deputization to do enforcement. In this case, I think it is worth noting that it does cut both ways. I mean, in theory, you could see if it were to pass, the parents of an LGBTQ child or anybody really, even suing for somebody quote unquote saying straight as opposed to saying gay, because they have drafted this to just apply to sexual orientation and gender identity discussion. That doesn't mean we're just talking about LGBTQ families. If you talk about an assignment for what you did over the holidays with your opposite sex parents, could somebody then bring that lawsuit and say, as a parent, I'm offended that you are in violation of this statute. So it's odd because we've seen such a focus in Florida of being a more business-friendly state and trying to get away from this reputation that it has as a very litigious state that is favorable to plaintiffs and those bringing lawsuits. But I think it speaks to sort of the lack of ideological consistency, frankly, that we see in the Capitol. While they want to argue for fewer lawsuits overall and sort of try to take this brave stand against frivolous lawsuits elsewhere, they're willing to create this new avenue for lawsuits in these other spaces that are totally counter to that principle. All right.
I have another question. I apologize if you answered this, but what is the teachers union's position on it? Teachers union?
Yeah.
Question. Yeah, the teachers union's position. Did you hear her?
I did.
Okay.
I know the teachers union, FEA, is the sort of primary education union that I hear from, that I see in the process. I know they've come out against the Stop Woke Act that we'll talk about next. I believe they have opposed Don't Say Gay, but I'm not positive. I do know the Florida PTA, Parent Teachers Association, has opposed both bills, and they've been really vocal, testifying in committee. And I do think it's hard, for organizations like PTA. Sometimes they're not showing up on our LGBTQ youth and school issues where we would like them to. They're great partners overall. Let me not, undermine them, but I'm using them as an example. But, they have very diverse membership that, has a lot of different political ideologies. So I'm really glad to see that PTA has, taken a position that we're in alignment with on both of these bills. But some of those organizations really do have a tough time with that. Another group that we get to work closely with in the Capitol is Afl-Cio. That does a lot of labor organizing. And I know that the teachers that they have brought up among their other union members have focused on the Don't Say Gay bill and talked about it. So we know we have a lot of mutual issues, and we're really appreciative of that support that we've seen. All right. I will say, I don't know if I can find the clip. I will see if we have pulled it and put it on social media, but as part of Lobby Days, there were a number of teachers who came up to the Capitol, and to hear them share their testimony in committee and talk to lawmakers about what they see as the impacts of this bill and how it will shake out in the classroom was really powerful, just to have that perspective from folks who are, in our schools day to day, when we know it is a really difficult time to be there. Right. And that is actually a good segue, because the next bill we're going to talk about is the quote unquote Stop Woke Act. And it applies very similarly in education and in private workplaces. Was there another question? Okay.
No, they're just, we're all just shaking our heads.
Understood. So the Stop Woke Act, you may recall Governor DeSantis did a press conference before session even began on this concept. He was really railing against the idea of critical race theory. Again, this is sort of where you see it just falling into that lane of a 2024 run in partisan politics after narratives around critical race theory were very influential in flipping the Virginia governor's race. This bill does not have critical race theory written into it expressly, but it is all about teaching about things like racism and then sexism and other forms of concepts like privilege, things like unconscious or implicit bias. And it's another place where we see a lot of censorship and new causes of action for people to bring lawsuits. It really flips our existing non-discrimination protections on their head. So it does open Florida's existing Civil Rights Act, which protects folks, on bases like sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, religion. And it's worth noting the protections in the Civil Rights Act for sexual orientation and gender identity were only realized or recognized really within about the last year because of the Supreme Court Bostock decision and its look at federal civil rights protections on the basis of sex and saying, if you have protections on the basis of sex, somebody who's facing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, sex has to be taken into account for that. So that's why those protections are there. For the purposes of this bill, it basically flips that on its head and says that now if you are, subjected to, made to go through like an diversity training or equality and inclusion training, and you are made to feel some sort of psychological discomfort or grief or guilt because of that training, that now you can sue. So in talking about those places where we might see discriminatory behavior, somebody can now say, I felt badly because of the way that conversation happened, and now I'm the victim and I should be able to sue. So what it's really doing is censoring what can be difficult conversations. And, we all deserve to be able to have honest conversations about things like Black history, LGBTQ history, the root causes of discrimination and injustice. And sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable, but that's how we make progress. It's how we grow. In the education sector, it's how we teach critical thinking skills. So we have a lot of concerns about how this would censor that sort of discussion. And the bill sponsors would say, well, you're allowed to teach about concepts like racism or sexism or slavery, but it has to be sort of purely objective. It can't be subjective or have any values based because that is indoctrination. And we don't want our schools indoctrinating students, which I think is an understandable concept. But what it means in practice is that you can acknowledge that something like slavery happened or that the Holocaust occurred, but we can't actually call those things out as being wrong or talk about, our movement away from that as a form of progress. And to me, it's been sort of mind-blowing to sit in the committee hearings and hear the bill sponsor talk about these things in language that you could not use in educational settings or in these diversity trainings under the bill. One of the Black senators, Senator Severn Jones, said, look, I'm very familiar with our own history and that at one point this country counted people like me as 3/5 of a person. And the bill sponsor sort of came back and said, well, of course that's horrible. We've made such tremendous progress. But that is the sort of subjectivity, calling it tremendous progress that you couldn't espouse under this bill, or that you would at least be liable for a lawsuit under. And it's really creating even a sort of double jeopardy for workplaces. As much as Florida has, held itself out as being business friendly and trying to recruit top businesses. And those businesses, of course, have by and large embraced things like diversity trainings, at least sexual harassment trainings. They have a legal responsibility to make sure that they're providing a workplace that is free from discrimination and harassment. But now they've got this double jeopardy, because if they don't provide the training, then they are setting themselves up for liability in a lawsuit for not, establishing the right culture and protections. And if they do have the training, now they can be sued for having the training. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And one of the senators, who is a labor and employment attorney, said, it is doubtless that this will open the floodgates to litigation, because you'll have folks who are terminated for an entirely unrelated reason. But, if they were sitting in that, say, a man sitting in that sexual harassment training 3 days earlier, they can come back and say, all the examples in that training involved men perpetuating sexual harassment, and that made me feel uncomfortable and caused me, distress on the basis of my sex. And now that employer is liable for that, which doesn't even get into the challenge of sort of how one proves, did somebody feel guilty or did somebody feel discomfort about something? Right now, our non-discrimination protections look at things like, can you show a pattern of being, denied a promotion or a raise, even though you were sort of meeting performance standards, and things that are much more identifiable and quantifiable than this sort of nebulous idea about how somebody is feeling psychologically. And again, I think that goes to the vagueness of the law and the general chilling effect. Where exactly is that line between teaching about the Holocaust and, inflecting some form of subjectivity about those events? And of course, we know sort of all of history involves some of that subjectivity. Like, history is written by the victors, so just our version of events would vary. We had some great history teachers talking about that in the legislature this week. But it will again have that chilling effect, where there's just a concern that, any conversation too close to this line could again lead to a lawsuit. So better to just avoid that from the lesson plan altogether. So unfortunately, again, sort of when we talk about this like surveillance slate, a place where we see more government control over those conversations that are so important, whether they are taking place in the workplace or a school, because they're about, how we grow and develop and, better ourselves. But this is another one that has a lot of momentum. Just this week, it passed its final House committee, which means the next stop is for it to go to the floor of the House, where all 120 lawmakers will vote on it. And it's passed one of its two Senate committees. So particularly because it has so much support from Governor DeSantis, we see a lot of that momentum. Any questions on that one?
I had something.
Yep. Hold on. Just for a second. Did you have something to say?
First of all, I like to say this right now. In life, people, when they're young, whatever, and the way they're raised up by family, friends, whoever, they can't help it because they've been messed with by anybody. I'm just gonna say anybody. It can be their family or friends or being institution and locked up somewhere. You have to be careful these days and time for your kids, whoever, and how to raise them. You can't trust nobody but God. And they can't help it because they may be molested or raped or whatever, and they grow up and become that way, whatever. I love people that have the ears. I see them as the ears. A man is a man to me. A woman's a woman to me. What's up? I see it. But people have rights to do what they want to do in life. Stuff. And see, man law and God law is different. Stuff. Everybody has a right to do what they want to do in life, but how to live their life, whatever, between them and God. That's
Thank you.
all right.
Yes. Okay, go, Flo.
Yeah, I was listening to Florida Focus or something like Florida Forum on the radio yesterday, and they were talking about, there was a proponent, there was an advocate for this bill that was defining the statute very narrowly and saying that, as an example, that a teacher can't go and say, okay, you have a German sounding last name, therefore you should feel bad about the Holocaust. And that is basically the specific provision of the bill, is that you cannot tell somebody to feel bad about it. This description gives a right to sue for being made uncomfortable. So it's kind of like a fine line that they're kind of, and the moderator pointed out that is not at all what the provision was. And he was trying to water it down or make it very narrow with regard to discrimination and this feeling of being this amorphous, undefined thing about being made uncomfortable. The lawmaker was saying, we all feel uncomfortable about history. Learning about history makes everybody feel uncomfortable, but this is giving us a provision for suing when you're called out specifically for being LGBT or a German last name or whatever. That was, so it's kind of like they're kind of diverting. Their tactic is to push this through by creating some kind of vagueness about the language, and it's very nefarious, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it goes to, again, the pressure that the legislature is feeling about these bills, because people are speaking out against it. I mean, it's worth, I should have mentioned on the Don't Say Gay bill, but I talked to a senator on Monday who said, they are getting so many emails about it that they are trying to create a rule to filter out those messages into a different inbox folder, because they're just being inundated on the Don't Say Gay bill as well as the Stop Woke Act. I think I'm actually surprised. It feels like the Stop Woke Act isn't getting the level of attention that I would expect it to, but they are hearing about that. And I think we're seeing some responses to that pressure. So to your point, the House and Senate versions are a little bit different. Certainly either one could pass. And the Senate is still in this space of where anybody can basically say that they were made to feel uncomfortable. The House did amend their bill on Tuesday of this past week to sort of narrow, as you said, to trainings that are telling you that you should be uncomfortable. I think that is very rare, if it is happening ever and at all, that a teacher is sort of standing up in front of a room and saying, thou shalt feel guilty for X. But I think it again goes to that general vagueness and confusion. And even if they are at that arguably narrower standard in the House, I think teachers aren't going to want to risk it. How do you exactly define where that line is between somebody who feels guilty or who feels like the teacher's words imply they should feel guilty? We should just be able to have these conversations, and they are uncomfortable. It's sort of like if you are acknowledging the fact, let me back up a second. One of the examples that the bill sponsor used in the House committee was basically calling out some big business. I don't know, we'll call it American Express or something. He said, American Express had a training for all of its employees that said America, was founded on systemic racism. So we had slavery. This is a fact we can all agree on, and that is something that at some level, if you, I think, identify as an American and claim that identity and benefit from it, I understand where a lot of people should feel some form of shame or guilt around that. It doesn't mean that, you or your parents or, your whatever direct ancestors were slave owners, but those are challenging concepts that we should feel uncomfortable about. There are Americans, people in our country who bought and sold people. We tore families apart. I mean, we have to question our humanity if that doesn't make you feel guilty or shame on some level if you claim that identity. So to have bills like this, I think that will just have such a damning impact on rolling back those kind of conversations and acknowledging that those things are in our history and we have to own them in some way. So
we got another question too. Thank you for that. This is Laura.
Hi, John. It's actually not a question. It's more of a comment because both of these acts apply to me so directly, and I'm choked up talking about it because I'm an LGBTQ member and I'm a 5th grade teacher who teaches American history. So I've been watching these go through, in the news and talking about it with fellow teachers, and I'm a union representative for my school as well. And coincidentally, I just taught a couple of weeks ago, my students learned about the Holocaust over the course of multiple days because it coincided with International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So we started the conversation and I said, this is hard history. This is the quote to my students. So we spoke about the Holocaust and they learned all about what happened during World War II with Jews and other millions of people who were murdered. And then in American history where we've been talking about colonization of North America, and slavery was the next conversation. So it continued and we spoke about slavery and that impact on our history the whole week. And this is where it's so disconnected because at no time do teachers point out kids and say, you should feel uncomfortable. Instead, the thing I say is none of us were there doing this, but we need to know that this happened in our history. And then at the end of the conversation, I had the students read a reflection in one of their stations about hard history. And my questions were, should we learn about hard history, including the Holocaust and slavery? And what are your lasting feelings? And all of my kids, 44 of them, feel that they should learn it and why it's so important and how we need to understand this as kids who live in America. And that's where the legislators do not understand what we're doing in schools. It's so ridiculous, and it makes me so furious that these people who've never stepped foot in a classroom and don't know anything about what goes on in there, they're trying to tell us the things that we need to do. So just so you know, our kids know, and they are very much on board with those of us who realize that this is important and these bills should not be passing. So I just wanted you to know that that's what's happening, at least with the 44 kids I know. And also, lastly, on the FEA website, there is a bill that they do mention the House Bill 1557 as a bill they're watching, and there's a clip of you speaking about it on the FEA website. So it is there, and even if they haven't made a big stink about it,
great.
They are.
Well, and thank you for bringing that up because it does, I think, reinforce this phenomenon we can see where this legislation is not responsive to what's happening in schools. And that was even clear, at the beginning of this discussion of critical race theory, that nobody is teaching in 5th grade or 1st grade or probably anywhere before, college level courses. But it sells to a certain extremist political base. And that's why they're pushing a narrative that then makes folks think that this is happening in schools when it's not. So it is a lot to push against. Unfortunately, their messaging is very effective. So we've got our work cut out for us in the Capitol, but I appreciate, certainly all of you engaging and being here today, and you in particular, who can speak from that personal standpoint as somebody who knows what is going on in these classrooms and can stand up and say, that is not how any of this works.
Thank you. Yep.
We're at 11:14, so if you're attending the 11:15 service, please, feel free to excuse yourself. If you'd like to stay and continue the conversation, please stay. On the table over there, there's a paper with some more information on the Don't Say Gay bill. There's a list of contacts with phone numbers for representatives. There are 2 sample letters that came from the Equality Florida website. So you can add your own personal notes to the bottom and mail off. And then on this table, there are envelopes, stamps, clipboards, whatever you need. If you want to write the letters right now, we will send them for you. But just there's more resources over there on your way out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Back over to you.
Okay.
Helen.
Yeah, just a general outrage that we were seeing this process of what we can talk about, what we can't. And if we want to talk about the whole learning experience of life, we can't isolate the negativity that happens because that is how we grow, either by the attraction to things that make us feel good and the avoidance of things that we get hurt, like with fire. And then somehow we're seeing this in so many avenues that we're trying to put a guardrail up from one group's perspective of what they're comfortable with, and a denial that life involves an awareness of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if we don't allow our children to experience and learn by that, we are taking away their ability to have a discretionary skill of their own. Right? It's outrageous.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jim?
Yeah, I just want to know the timeline. How much time do we have left to stop these things? You know, obviously we want to act now, but if you could guesstimate how much time, like a month, 2 months?
It does feel like there's urgency on these bills. I'm surprised how quickly things are moving. And really, you know, Equality Florida's sort of first mission in the Capitol is usually defense. We sort of have to focus more on stopping the bad things before we get to put attention on advancing the good things. And one of the best ways we do that is just running out the clock and sort of, you know, gumming up the works, slowing things down. We've been able to do it some, but I am surprised how quickly these things are moving. As I mentioned, session doesn't end until March 11th. So they have until then to pass these bills. For the Stop Woke Act, my expectation is that it will be on the House floor, not this upcoming week, but potentially the week after. And then it would still have to go through its process on the Senate side. The Don't Say Gay bill is a little bit further back, but even it only has one more committee stop in each chamber. And I know that they are working on some amendments and things to, I think, sort of try to make it more attractive. But what I'm hearing about those amendments doesn't address sort of the root issues at all. So I don't expect them to be anything that, you know, really neutralizes the harm in these bills. But I would say, yeah, the sooner that outreach can be done, the better. We had, you know, 100 folks up in Tallahassee Monday, Tuesday of last week. I think we'll have about 40 to 50 on Monday, Tuesday this week. So I'm glad we've been able to put that pressure on. But yeah, definitely the sooner the better. I mentioned that, you know, when things come up for a vote, we're seeing people move in blocks so much, and it's really hard to sort of peel folks off, because once they are sitting, you know, behind that podium or at the dais and have to take a vote, they know how much scrutiny they're under. But the early pressure is what helps it from ever getting to that point, because these bills don't have to be put on the agenda. In fact, many, many bills never get put on the agenda by the committee chair, who controls that process of whether they come up for a vote or not. So in a lot of ways, it's like we need to create that early pressure so that they see what a headache it is to hear these bills. Like, you know, last week with the Don't Say Gay bill, knowing that 80 people showed up for that bill, that's going to take up a lot of time. And we are getting to the point in session that is later. And the more time they spend on this, the less time they have for all those other bills. So, you know, they chugged through 6 bills in probably 20 minutes and then spent another hour and 40 minutes on this one bill. So it sort of means, look, it is going to be hard for you if you hear this, and a lot of other priorities are going to fall by the wayside. So how much do you really want to do this? And all of those forms of outreach, those letters, those emails, even social media, and, you know, tweeting at people. I will confess, I don't have Twitter. Me and the soccer moms are just on Facebook, but it all helps. And they do, you know, respond to that outreach.
Wonderful. John, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being so engaged and following along.
Yeah, we appreciate all your hard work. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. I don't know how to. Oh. Oh, there we go. Oh, that little button right there.
See it inside it.